Your mute mother doesn't belong at this table, Aaliyah. Get her out of sight. The clinking of crystal died instantly. At the center of the grand ballroom, Ruby stood frozen. Her dress was neat, pressed, but noticeably faded among the sea of silk and diamonds. Her hands shook, rattling the porcelain plate she held. Across the table stood her son-in-law, Damon, his face twisted in cold disgust. He didn't whisper. He wanted everyone to hear. Take your plate to the kitchen, Ruby. You've already cost me one guest's suit. Your presence here is an embarrassment. Your mute mother doesn't belong at this table, Aaliyah. Get her out of sight. At the far end of the room, a powerfully built man in a bespoke suit slowly set down his wine glass. His eyes found Damon and did not move. Ruby had not always been silent. 30 years ago, she was a completely different person, until a catastrophic fire tore through a textile facility, changing her life forever. What exactly happened in those flames that stole her voice? And who is the powerful stranger sitting at the far end of the room, watching Damon's arrogance with a look of pure calculation? Ruby quietly lowers her head, bites her lip to stop the trembling, and begins the long, lonely walk toward the kitchen doors while the guests pretend not to watch. To look at Damon and Aaliyah's life is to look at a masterclass in modern opulence. They reside in a multi-million-dollar architectural marvel, all sharp lines, heated marble floors, and soaring walls of glass designed to let the light in. Every corner of their home screams success. But if you walk past the pristine courtyard, past the luxury vehicles, and head toward the detached structure over the 3-car garage, the reality shifts instantly. This is where Ruby is forced to live, a single drafty room above the garage, no windows, no warmth, the sound of the garage doors below her only company. Ruby's silence was not a birth defect, nor was it a choice. 3 decades ago, she was a vibrant woman working long shifts at a local textile manufacturing plant. One freezing winter evening, a catastrophic electrical fire broke out, engulfing the facility in black, toxic smoke within seconds. While others ran for the exits, Ruby did the unthinkable. She crawled back into the inferno. She managed to drag 2 small, suffocating children out of the collapsing structure. The intense, searing heat and toxic chemical fumes scorched her throat, permanently destroying her vocal cords. One of those children was her 5-year-old daughter, Aaliyah. The identity of the second child, however, was lost in the chaos of that night, leaving behind a cold case of uncredited heroism. Ruby sacrificed her own voice so her daughter could have a breath of life. For years after the fire, Ruby and Aaliyah were inseparable. Ruby learned to speak with her hands, and Aaliyah learned to listen with her eyes. There are photographs from that period, Ruby signing a bedtime story, Aaliyah laughing, both of them entirely fluent in the language they had built together. Those photographs still exist somewhere in the estate. No one displays them anymore. As the years progressed, that monumental sacrifice was slowly eroded by greed. When Aaliyah married Damon, a man obsessed with social climbing and elite optics, her gratitude transformed into deep resentment. Damon convinced Aaliyah that Ruby's physical condition was a social liability. Under his influence, Aaliyah began to view her mother's sign language and muted attempts at communication as an embarrassment to their high society image. Aaliyah, vicious whisper, eyes darting toward the main house. Mom, just stay upstairs tonight. Damon's investors are coming. If they see you signing and making those sounds, it ruins everything. Just stay out of sight. Ruby does not fight back. She cannot. She simply nods, her trembling fingers smoothing down the edges of her faded apron. But later that night, when the house is silent and the investors have gone, Ruby does something she has done every night for 30 years. She opens the small wooden box she keeps beneath her cot, the only object Damon has never thought to confiscate, because he has never once looked closely enough at her to notice it exists. Inside is a photograph, a legal document folded to a quarter of its size, and a single silver locket. She does not look at the photograph. She does not unfold the document. She simply holds the locket in her palm, closes her fingers around it, and waits. She has always known this moment would come. She has simply never known when. Would you have stayed silent if you saw a family treat their own mother this way? Let us know in the comments below. Behind the towering glass walls of Damon's architectural masterpiece, his real estate development firm was quietly bleeding to death. A series of overleveraged land acquisitions had brought his firm to the edge of catastrophic collapse. Damon was desperate. His entire future hinged on securing a single, decisive investment from one man, Xavier Vance, a reclusive venture capitalist known for his uncompromising standards. Vance vetted not just the balance sheet but the household, the people behind the firm. To Damon, an unblemished, picture-perfect family dynamic was the ultimate currency needed to seal this deal. But as he scrutinized his household, he didn't see a mother who had sacrificed her body for his wife. He saw an unsightly defect. Damon decided that to appear flawless for Vance's upcoming visit, Ruby could no longer exist in the periphery. She had to be purged from the household. The cruelty arrived in stages, a calculated stripping away of Ruby's last threads of independence. Damon began intercepting her mail, deliberately confiscating the specialized medical packages containing the throat therapies that eased her daily physical discomfort. But his most chilling act of isolation was cutting the digital lines to the room above the garage. He disconnected the wireless internet, intentionally rendering Ruby's text-to-speech tablet useless. This device was her only connection to the outside world, her solitary method of transforming thoughts into audible language. Without it, she was utterly locked inside her own mind. In the damp, unlit room, Ruby sat alone in the dark, the faint moonlight catching the movement of her trembling hands. She tried frantically to scratch out a message on a torn scrap of cardboard using a broken, leaking ballpoint pen, her fingers freezing as the ink bled into the paper. She was a prisoner in a house built on her own suffering, unable to scream for help because the man she welcomed into her family had stolen her ability to speak. The tension reached its peak on the evening of the firm's 10th anniversary gala, a high society banquet designed exclusively to impress Xavier Vance. Damon forced Ruby out of her room, but not to afford her a seat of honor. Instead, he compelled her to work the floor as an unpaid, silent maid, utilizing her labor to slash catering costs and ensure control over her movements. Dressed in her faded attire, she moved quietly through the crowded ballroom, carrying heavy trays of crystal champagne flutes. Then, the catalyst occurred. An intoxicated investor turned around abruptly, colliding heavily into Ruby. The collision sent a glass of dark red wine splashing across the guest's expensive white tuxedo. The room fell silent. To save face and protect his business alliance, Damon didn't investigate. He didn't check if his mother-in-law was hurt. He chose public execution. Stepping forward, his face contorted in rage, he barked the words that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. "Take your plate to the kitchen, Ruby. You've already cost me one guest's suit. Your presence here is an embarrassment. Your mute mother doesn't belong at this table. Get her out of sight." Damon's cruel declaration still hung in the air as the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open. Xavier Vance walked into the room. The reclusive venture capitalist did not arrive with a large entourage or a loud announcement. His presence alone shifted the gravity of the entire space. He moved with an effortless authority that money cannot buy. He had not come here for Damon's firm. His investigators had confirmed Ruby's location at this household 3 weeks earlier. Tonight was never about the investment. Damon instantly wiped the rage from his face, forcing a practiced smile as he hurried forward to greet his potential savior. He desperately tried to steer Vance away from the service corridor, attempting to block the view of Ruby, who was still on her knees quietly absorbing the humiliation, trying to wipe the spilled wine from the polished floor with a cloth. But Vance was not looking at Damon's extended hand. His gaze moved once, to the service hallway, where Ruby was still on her knees, quietly pressing a cloth to the spilled wine on the floor. He had heard every word. His jaw tightened, a small, private calculation, and then his expression closed completely. He lowered his hand, walked past Damon without a word, and took his seat at the head table. What Damon did not know was simple: the firm was already gone. Vance had purchased the controlling position 3 weeks earlier, through channels that left no trace. The contract Damon was about to offer him was worthless. The house they were standing in would follow. Damon was celebrating ownership of things that already belonged to someone else. As the evening drew to a close, Vance requested a private, closed-door meeting in Damon's home office to sign the contracts. Damon was ecstatic, practically vibrating with the belief that his financial ruin was about to be permanently erased. But right before they stepped away from the ballroom, Vance paused, turned his cold gaze back to Damon, and issued a singular, non-negotiable directive. Before I sign the capital release, I require every single member of this household to be present in the room. Not just your executives, Damon. Every individual who resides on this property, including the staff. I do not invest in businesses, I invest in ecosystems. Damon, blinded by his own arrogance, agreed instantly, thinking it was merely the eccentric whim of a powerful billionaire. Aaliyah sat on the leather sofa, adjusting her diamond necklace, her eyes fixed on the contract resting on the mahogany desk. Damon stood over the contract, pen in hand. And at the very back of the room, standing shadowed near the heavy exit door, was Ruby. Damon had ordered her to stand there so she wouldn't ruin the framing of the room. Her head was bowed, her shoulders tense, entirely unaware of why she had been summoned to witness the triumph of the man who had systematically stripped her of her humanity. Xavier Vance sat down at the desk. He took a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and hovered the nib a millimeter above the signature line. Damon held his breath, staring at the ink. But Vance stopped. He slowly looked up, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto Damon. Before I attach my name to your firm, Damon, I want to ask you a question about your foundational philosophy. How do you handle the elements of your operation that you deem inefficient? The ones that can no longer produce a vocal output for your bottom line. Damon chuckled nervously. He leaned forward, delivering a cold, arrogant speech about modern leadership, stating proudly that success requires cutting away useless, dead weight without emotion. Vance let out a long, quiet breath. He carefully placed the gold pen back into his breast pocket and stood up. He didn't look at the contract again. He walked past Damon, ignored Aaliyah's confused expression, and walked straight through the center of the office, heading directly toward the dark corner near the exit. He stopped less than a foot away from Ruby. No one moved. And then Vance reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in a faded silk cloth, and gently placed it into Ruby's trembling hands. Ruby's fingers unfolded the faded silk cloth with agonizing slowness. Resting in her palm was a small, heavily scarred silver locket, its surface bearing the unmistakable warping of extreme heat. With a trembling hand, she reached into her collar and pulled out the identical silver locket she had worn every single day for 30 years. The two pieces completed each other, the same engraving visible beneath the same scarring. Damon stared. The color left his face in a single, slow withdrawal, and he reached for the edge of the desk to steady himself. The second child was Xavier Vance. He had spent his entire adult life tracking down the woman who gave up her voice so he could have a future. The locket had been in his pocket every day for 30 years. Vance turned away from Ruby, his shoulders dropping to stillness. When he looked at Damon, his eyes were devoid of warmth. You told me tonight that success requires cutting away dead weight, Damon. You told everyone at that table that this woman was a penniless, mute burden who didn't deserve a seat. Vance stepped back toward the desk, picking up the unsigned contract and tearing it down the center with a slow, deliberate rip. But what your greed blinded you to is that I didn't build my empire alone. Ruby's sacrifice bought my life, and my wealth belongs to her. He didn't need to sign anything. He had purchased the firm quietly, through channels Damon never saw. He already owned all of it. He had placed it all in a trust. Ruby's name was on it. Damon, now stripped of his company, his capital, and his home, collapsed back against the desk. Aaliyah burst into tears. She rushed toward Ruby, reaching out to grab her hands, sobbing out frantic, empty apologies about how she had been pressured by Damon. Ruby looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she shook her head, once, slowly, with a deliberateness that was not anger and not forgiveness. Vance stepped forward, his imposing frame completing the barrier Ruby had already drawn. She did not raise her hand in anger, nor did she make a sound. Instead, she took the broken pen and the torn scrap of cardboard she had carried in her apron pocket since the night Damon cut her off from the world, wrote a brief message with a steady, unhurried hand, and placed it flat on the desk in front of Damon. The narration reads the words aloud. "My voice was taken by the fire, but my dignity was not. You are dismissed from this company, and you are removed from this house. To my daughter, I gave my voice so you could live. I did not know you would spend it for me." Within minutes, corporate security guards entered the office. Damon and Aaliyah were escorted out of the architectural masterpiece, forced to walk past the elite guests who were already whispering about their sudden, public downfall. Months later, the story shifts away from the cold glass and concrete of Damon's former estate. The camera focuses on a stunning, sunlit home overlooking a peaceful coastline, where the air is clean and the rooms are filled with light. Vance purchased this estate for Ruby. On the first morning, Ruby walked out onto the terrace, turned her face toward the ocean, and stood there for a long time, doing nothing, going nowhere, belonging entirely to herself. The final sequence of this story brings us back to a dining table, but this one is entirely different. It is a massive, beautifully crafted oak table bathed in warm afternoon sunlight. Ruby sits at the head, dressed in an elegant gown that she wears with effortless grace. Sitting right beside her is Xavier Vance. He gently signs a message to her, and for the first time in 3 decades, a smile spreads across Ruby's face. Damon was convicted of financial fraud and elder exploitation. Ruby established the Voice of Fire Foundation, named after the fire that started everything, funded by the company that was built on her silence. The garage room was emptied. As the sun drops below the waterline, Ruby opens a leather-bound journal. She writes 2 words. She hooks the tablet to her speaker system and presses play. A calm digital voice fills the terrace. "I'm home." The ocean continues behind it. Xavier Vance raises his glass.